I started, the first time I ever went to a Quaker meeting was in response to dissatisfaction with the church I was going to. I felt that the minister was being trivial, and he was taking up all the time with his pastoral prayers and responsive readings and things like that. And there wasn't any time for me to be reverent. There wasn't any time for me to do anything, to pray or to have any input that was my own.
You were already an adult at that time.
I was an adult. My husband was a graduate student at Harvard, and this was a Cambridge suburb. And so I decided to go to a Quaker meeting, when it was suggested to me that I might try that one as well as the Episcopal Church and some others that I'd been to. I said, oh, but the Quakers went out with the Pilgrims. I thought they were extinct. And Jean said, no, they meet right down on Brattle Street, and you can just go down there, and the only thing is, remember not to testify the first time you go in. And so I went, and it was a snowy day, and there was the place was full, and a man would get up once in a while and put a log on the open fire, and all these people sitting there, open. Jean had told me enough about it so that I knew a little bit of what they were doing, and they were open to the Word of God coming to them just right then, and they were being quiet and listening, and it blew my mind. It blew my mind. I had a tremendous religious experience right then. So but then the war intervened, and I was separated from any Quaker meeting that until about 6 years later, when I was here in Madison, and very much in need of something different, of some spiritual life that was different from the church that I had gone back to again. And Jean again knew that there was a Quaker meeting here, and told me that it was in the Congregational Student House, which is where he and I had met quite a few years before. And so I went there and again had a very good experience. Partly Mildred Ashman just was so receptive to me and the problems that I came with that day that I just was completely sold right then.
Okay.
Jean was teaching on the faculty at that point. He was an assistant professor of Asian history, and I had been a student here. So had he. Before I grew up in Milwaukee. I'm a Sturgeon Bay. I was born in Sturgeon Bay, grew up in Milwaukee, and came to school here. So this has really been home to me since 1935, and so it was like coming home after the war to come back to Madison.
Tell us about some of the way the Meeting for Worship felt, some of the things they did in the early days.
Well, we met in the Congregational Student House, which was really just a little room with some old furniture in it, and it was really it's on the spot that now is part of the Humanities Building. Just a couple buildings south of the University Club, and it was one of those old houses, and there were quite a few children, as I recall, but none of them First Day School didn't meet regularly. It didn't meet every single Sunday until the Boardman kids came, because there were 4 of them for one thing, and they were never sick. And the other people had just 1 or 2 kids, and the kid's sick, and then there isn't any First Day School. But with our kids as a nucleus, the meeting really kind of the First Day School kind of coalesced.
How did you work that out then?
We took turns and moved them into another room, you know, and they were all little tads. We didn't have any big kids. We had, I think our child was, our oldest one was about 6, and the others were all younger than that. So the meeting itself was very small. I think there were only, maybe 10 at the most, maybe 15 people, something like that. And it was a very gathered group, almost always. As I recall, it was, there was, I don't know how to, I'm not good at describing spiritual things. All I can say is that it was working for me, and that it was what I needed, and I had a lot of needs, and the meetings supplied a whole lot of them. It took care of a lot of them for me, including some social ones, because we began having potlucks and things like that, which were very nice for me. But the spiritual part was very good. I think, though, that my spiritual awakening was many years before. I went to a church in Milwaukee that was a big one, a big congregational church, and I believed everything they told me. You know, they said you should love your neighbor, so I thought I should love my neighbor. And you should love your enemy, and I thought I should love my enemy. I really believed everything they told me. I just sucked it up. And nobody else in my family feels accepted it that way, and I would argue current affairs very young because it wasn't working according to these things they taught us in church, and that's the way it's supposed to be, see? And it was very naive of me in a way, and yet it wasn't too bad. And somewhere along the way I got hold of a book called The Hidden Years by John Oxenham, an Englishman. And it's about the life of Jesus during the between the time when he was 12 and when he appeared openly in the in his ministry, and it's what he was like. It was just pure. It was fiction, but it really set me in how a person, even a teenage person, which I was then, could even in these days, or those days, live what you believe, see. And so I really tried very hard, and I was very obnoxious. I mean, I argued a lot, and was considered a difficult child and so forth, because I argued a lot of this stuff too. And people thought that I was being, well, I guess I was. I was being very, very rigid in what I believed. So I was really ready for Quakerism when I found it. That here was a way of worshiping, of meditating, that wasn't interrupted by responsive readings and stuff like that, which I find so offensive, just so, not offensive, just irritating, you know. And here was a way to get God's word to act right. And that was real important to me in those years.
What about in terms of acceptance of your particular style of so the activist approach to?
Well, that didn't come for a while, and when it did, it was, well, I think the first activist thing I did was a group of about 5 of us, I think it was, fasted for 2 days, 48 hours, and sent notices to the newspaper that we were fasting in protest against the nuclear tests. And we got publicity all over the place. We got letters from Japan and New York and Washington and all kinds of places, everywhere. It really hit the papers, and just 5 of us fasting to stop nuclear testing.
Here in Madison?
Mm-hmm. And it was done.
4 members of the meeting? Or?
Yeah, we were all members of the meeting, and that was wonderful. I remember going to a history department cocktail party or something like that afterwards. I broke my fast at this party, and which was sort of weird. And here the history department's a pretty hard-nosed bunch, you know, and they were they all gathered around me, wanted to know about it and so forth, and I was sort of the center of their attention, which never happened again, but I assure you, with the history department. But from then on, I'll tell you what happened with Vietnam. We were in Japan in 1963 for about 7 months with the two youngest boys. Jean was doing research there. And we went to Quaker meeting in Tokyo. And the Japanese, dozens of them, found a way of asking us, what are you doing about the Vietnamese? What your country's doing to Vietnam. Well, we didn't know what our country, well, Jean might have, but I didn't know what my country was doing to Vietnam. But I tell you, I found out, because if something was going on that the Japanese knew about that I didn't know about, I better find out. And I did, and that was when I began to be interested in that. And we did all the usual things then, writing the letters and standing in a vigil out what we used to call Lower Campus, what do you call it now? Library Mall. Mm-hmm. And we stood out there for a couple years, you know, between 64, 66, something like that. And then then Jean and I worked for Friends Committee on National Legislation for a year, lobbying. He was lobbying for a new China policy. And while there, I met the group of people that became a Quaker Action Group. And we did some actions there. One action in particular that put us in jail for overnight. And it was the next day that we really set up the organization, meeting in the FCNL conference room. And they passed around papers to sign. Will you raise money for this project, or do you want to go on the project? And the third paper was, will you help to explain it? In other words, make speeches and stuff.
These are petitions to greater.
They weren't petitions. They were just for our own use, to see who was willing to do what. I signed all three of them, and I was really surprised when I was called, because it was the first Quaker project of that type in this century that had any women in it at all, and it was a problem even then, my being a woman in the project, but not insurmountable.
And you were the only one?
Well, Earl Reynolds' wife was along until Hong Kong. She didn't go to Vietnam with us, but she didn't participate in any of the. She took care of the food part of the time, but she just wasn't there. She was out of sight. She was in the captain's cabin, and we didn't see her. She didn't stand watches with us or anything like that. And somehow I think I was wrong in saying in the book that I wrote that I was the only woman, or any time that I said that was really wrong. I was the only one that went on to Vietnam. But in the early stages of it, she certainly was there, and she certainly did a job of feeding us and so forth.
Just in terms of prefacing, before we get into the discussion, would you just describe exactly what the action was?
The action the action of the Phoenix trip was the reason it was called the Phoenix trip was because the name of the boat was the Phoenix, and the boat itself, it was a 50-foot ketch. Earl Reynolds had used it for some projects like this before. He'd gone up into Russian waters, and he'd done some other ones. And he also sailed into the atomic bomb testing area in the Pacific in that boat. He with his wife, Barbara. And they'd sailed with their family around the world before that. This project was to carry medical supplies to the North Vietnamese for whoever needed it. If pressed, we handed it to people we handed it to the Vietnamese as a gift to the people. And it was definitely not to go to the army, but I don't think any of us really cared about that. I mean, somebody who needs it should have it. And we had $10,000 worth of medical supplies, which were chosen and packed by the doctors of Hiroshima. And we sailed we flew to Japan, where the Phoenix was anchored, and then we sailed out into the Pacific from Tokyo Harbor, which is a great long, many miles long harbor with a lot of cities along the edges of it. I didn't know all that until I actually did it, you know. And we out into the ocean, and then into the inland sea, and to Hiroshima. And at that point, I left the ship for several reasons. To go to Cambodia, because that was the only place we could talk to the Vietnamese, and they had already twice refused us permission to enter Haiphong Harbor on the grounds that it was too dangerous. And they said, this is very nice of you to bring us these gifts, but leave them at a neutral place and we'll pick them up. Well, we didn't want to do that because we really wanted to meet them. We wanted to see Vietnam, and we wanted to be able to come back to America and say, we've seen these people and they are people. They are human beings, and they don't deserve what you're doing to them, you know, or something. We didn't know what we would say, but we suspected it'd be something like that, and it was. So I was detached from the group and sent to Cambodia, and then Carl Zitlow, who was late getting into the project, flew over from New York to around through Europe, and we met in Bangkok and then flew into Phnom Penh, and he spent 10 days there talking to the Vietnamese and getting permission and finding out who they were, first of all. It took a day or so to find out who it was that we were going to be talking to, you know. And we had some names from Russell Johnson, who'd been running seminars there, Quaker seminars in various places, and he knew a lot of these people. So he gave us some names, and we were able to function that way.
He was running Quaker seminars where?
In Southeast Asia.
I see.
In years past. Before then, he hasn't. I don't think he's done it since. And we did that, and then I flew back to Hong Kong. Flew to Hong Kong. He went in direct. He stayed in Cambodia for a while, and then about the time we were expected in Vietnam, he flew in there on a what do they call it? The plane that went in regularly. I can't say it right now. And I waited in Hong Kong until the boat came down from Japan. And that was about a 2-week trip through a lot of. We had storms all the way. And we got. Then we waited a week in Hong Kong, mainly because I'd set it up that way, and the captain didn't like that. He wanted us to leave right away, but I'd set it up that way with the Vietnamese, and so that was what we did. And then we had a 5-day sail into Vietnam, and we stayed there first in Haiphong for a day, and then had a night trip over the bridges, which only exist in the nighttime. They're taken apart in the daytime. They're boats with planks on them, is what they are. And then we spent a total of 8 days in Vietnam.
What was your impression of North Vietnam?
Well, I thought it was a marvelous place. I really liked the way the people worked and the way they worked together. I've always been very attracted to cooperatives and cooperative ways of doing things. I'm really kind of sour on it right now, but it hasn't really worked for me, except in Crestwood. The cooperative community that I brought my children up in, and that I thought was completely successful. But these other ventures I've had since then have not been. But Vietnam seemed to me like the ideal cooperative community. For instance, in one place we saw a bunch of women coming in for lunch to collect their children and have their lunch, and they'd been working together in the field. And the camaraderie that we saw among these women was something I had never seen. I worked in offices that were all women, You never saw faces like that in an office, there was much more backbiting that I had seen, and I thought that this was beautiful, really nice. And you know, a bomb falls or something breaks, and everybody goes out and fixes it. The schools go out, the kids go out and shovel dirt, and the mothers come out of the houses, and everybody gets to work and fixes it, and then they go back to their jobs. And there was something about that. Now, I'm not sure that's still working there. I don't think that it's innate to the people. I think it was in the situation to some extent that they thought they could survive this if they all worked together.
You feel maybe that was a wartime
Yeah,
kind of togetherness?
I think
which
so.
I guess developed in this country too, to some extent.
There was a certain amount of that in World War II. There was more of it then than more of that camaraderie and willingness to help each other. Everybody had to go without meat, for instance, during World War II, and that was people learned to do it, you know, and because somebody else needed it worse.
So you were in Hanoi at a time when it was regularly being bombed?
Yes. The Haiphong, when we came in the harbor, it was being bombed. And
Right then, at the time?
At the time, yeah. And we turned off the lights. The soldiers that were on when we picked up our pilot, he came over in a boat with some Vietnamese military people. I don't know if they were soldiers or what. And there was also a man from VOSA, which is the Vietnam Ocean Shipping Organization, Association or something, and agency, that's the word. And he was responsible for us. There was a pilot who told the captain how to steer his way in at very slow speed. And it took, again, that was a long, long harbor. I mean, a long route into the city, to Haiphong. Took many, many hours. We got there in about noon, and we got to the, we waited, you know, to the buoy where we were supposed to wait, buoy 0. And we waited there for a couple hours, and then this small boat came off of a Russian freighter that was sitting out, anchored out near us. And they came aboard, and the boat went back, and then we made our way in, and it was midnight before we got to the wharf where we were tied up. We stopped at one of the soldiers heard on his radio that the planes were going over, and he told us to stop and turn off all the lights and to go down below decks. Well, we didn't go below decks because we knew there was just one layer of plywood between them. You know, there just wasn't any point in it. And so we stayed up and watched. You know, it was much more interesting. And we saw a fight. Well, we saw one plane hit by a missile and exploded. And our companions there, of course, cheered. And when you're down underneath and they're dropping bombs on you, it's really hard not to cheer when they get theirs. You know, it's an awkward position. And then I think it was either the next day or the day after. I think it was maybe 2 days later in Hanoi. We were talking to some people in one of the offices, and they sent us out to go into a shelter. And then we saw them, the shelter was so low that us tall Americans all had to duck our heads like this. And then somebody ran out with a bunch of chairs so that we could sit down and get our heads off the ceiling, you know. And then we realized that all of them were sitting on the porch, standing on the porch, that we'd taken their place. And so Earl Reynolds started to go out. And just then a plane swooped down within, you know, just ear-shatteringly low. I don't know how low. And we all sort of ducked, and Earl yelled back, "Don't worry, it's ours." And we and we all just died laughing because it really was a Vietnamese plane, you know. But he had instantly changed sides, you know. It just It's really funny what happens when you're underneath. That's why I don't believe the things I hear about the prisoners who were in Hanoi. You know, Hanoi Hilton they called it.
About the way they were treated.
Well, that they cheered every time the American planes went over. I don't believe that, because they were under the bombs too. You know, and I just think that would take something else.
Was there any desire to, or maybe even that you did visit the prison?
We decided not to, because just before we left the States, we had planned to, but just before we left the States, the State Department put out a little news release that a Quaker group was going to go to Hanoi and look at the prisons, and we decided we can't be tarnished with their brush, you know. So we didn't say a word. We just didn't do it. But it was. They hadn't said that to us. What they'd said to us was, "Don't go."
Yeah, tell me about the
They were
official
just plain
reaction.
lying. What?
Tell me about the official reaction.
The official reaction was totally negative. They froze two bank accounts we had before we ever left. Treasury Department did, and so we mostly carried the money on our bodies after that, including me. I carried a fair amount of money over there, and that was very scary. Also, before anybody knew I was going, I sent $5,000 to a friend of mine in Japan, and in just traveler's checks, you know. It was weird, and told her just to stick it in her bra because it was the real thing. Well, first, I didn't tell her that in the first letter. I sent 2 letters a day apart because I didn't want them to go in the same mail. First, I sent the stuff and I just said, "Take care of this, it's real." And I'll be over shortly to explain it. And then, and she didn't pay any attention to it much. She just stuck it in her dresser drawer. And then she got the next letter the next day, and I said, "That's $5,000 and it's real, and guard it." And she panicked a bit then. I think it went under the mattress at that point. But the official, we got to know every place we went. We tried to get our passports validated for travel in Vietnam, because it says on there that you can't go. It says on the thing that you can't take the passport to Vietnam. And when we came back, they took our passports, and then we tested that in the courts by attaching our case to Stoughton Lynn's. Stoughton Lynn had gone to Cuba just some months before, and they had taken his passport, and he had sued, and we had. So what we did was to say whatever happens with Stoughton's is okay with us, and the decision was that the passport belongs to the State Department, and the State Department can do what it wants to with its own passport, but nobody can tell people where they can go. And so if you don't use your passport, you can go anywhere you want. And the Vietnamese were smart about this, because they didn't. They collected our passports as soon as we came ashore, but they never stamped them. And so in effect, we didn't use them. But they did. The last day we were out, before we got to Haiphong, planes circled over us, and a helicopter hovered over next to us and took pictures of us and stuff. Navy vehicles, Navy equipment, and
US.
what?
A US.
U.S. Navy, yeah. And we'd given them an itinerary. We made a point of going up to the embassy and giving it to them in Hong Kong. So we weren't too surprised. We were a little scared. We weren't sure whether they'd stop us before we got there or stop us, because then we thought, well, no, they shouldn't stop us before we get there because we haven't done anything. You know, the seas are open. We have freedom of the seas. But once we had done this, then they might have done something. And on the way back, they did overfly us again, and that was, people were a little more nervous then. Yeah. I didn't seem to get nervous about those things. Somehow it just didn't feel to me like something I needed to be scared of. I was scared of the men falling overboard during the storms because I thought they were careless, and I was really afraid of that. And I was afraid of some other little habits that you have at sea that are very dangerous, like the way men go to the toilet. According to our captain's rules, there was a head there and everything, but the men weren't allowed to use it. And I thought that was pretty dangerous. And it turned out it was too, because the post they were hanging on to was rotted through, they found when they got back. So, and there was no way, if we'd lost anybody overboard, that would have been it. There was no way you could have picked them up again, because a sailboat, a boat like that doesn't, you can't be sure it'll come back to where you were, you know. So.
As the idea evolved to carry on with the project in its formative stages, what were some of the reservations or discussions, ideas? What was some of the spirit behind the group that conceived the project?
Well, the idea evolved from, we've got to do something, we don't know what, to we really ought to, well, it even went through the idea of getting, putting a lot of bodies between the enemies. That isn't a good idea. In the first place, it might be all right during some kinds of wars, but this kind you can't do it because it's mostly from the air, and it would have been impossible to do. So that one was quickly dropped. And then the idea was to send a bunch of people to Vietnam by way of Russia, overland. And that's when they invited me to go. I thought that was great. And we would stay in Russia, sort of stay there till we got permission to go into Vietnam. And I had got out my old Russian books and started studying the language again, you know. And Gene thought that was a great idea. I think he thought it was absolutely kooky, you know, and that it wouldn't happen. So he was absolutely in favor of it. He thought that was great. But then Horace Champney got the idea of using the Phoenix, which we all knew about because Earl had used it for all these other things. And Horace remembered that it was in Tokyo Harbor and probably was usable. Now, Horace didn't know anything about the sea or boats or anything, but he was the one with the idea. And they immediately wired Earl, and he said, well, he'd been thinking of something like that himself. So it was, the idea went across real well, and AQAG, A Quaker Action Group, raised quite a bit of money. It raised all the money for the project, which Earl might have had more trouble doing. And of course, there were enough of us too to really spread ourselves around a bit. He wouldn't allow very many people on the boat. The boat had only 4 bunks besides the captain's quarters, and so we used the hot bunk system. You know, you're either you're either on, or how do we say it, on watch or off watch, and the people off watch were in the bunks, and the people on watch weren't, and then you traded. You know, and it works okay, and. But the project didn't evolve. There wasn't too much more evolution after that. That was pretty straightforward. There were time gaps and stuff. And the spiritual part, there was just no question about that. I mean, a war is wrong. Innocent people are being killed. It's corrupting our own people, our own selves. And you got to do something. That's all. And the thing that really bothers me now is that I don't do anything anymore. You know, and I guess every once in a while I hear about somebody doing something and I think, well, good, because I'm not doing it, so I'm glad you were. But that's kind of too bad, too.
how did it, what was the feeling about your adventures in Madison Monthly Meeting?
Well, I made a mistake there. I should have brought it to the meeting earlier. I should have gotten permission or approval of the meeting, and it never occurred to me. I just didn't think about that. I knew that the meeting didn't like war, and it didn't seem to me there was a problem. And I wasn't supposed to talk about it very much because we had a lot of things to do, like getting, I had to get my passport, and I had to get my Japanese visa, and we had to raise some money, and then I had a lung embolism just 10 days before I was supposed to leave, and was in the hospital for 5 days. And you know, that was not supposed to happen. And earlier, I'd known for about a month that I was going, but I wasn't supposed to talk a lot about it. So when I did, I picked, let's see, I was leaving on a Monday. Well, a week from the Sunday before that, in other words, 8 days before, I came to meeting prepared to tell the meeting. And lo and behold, sitting in behind me was John Patrick Hunter. And he was a neighbor of ours, you know, out in Crestwood. And he had told me years before that he really was curious about the Quaker meeting and he wanted to come. And I said, well, come, just any time, just come. He picked that day to come. And he's, as a reporter on the Capital Times, I wasn't supposed to do anything. I wasn't supposed to tell anybody until the weekend. And on the weekend, I was supposed to ask for call a press conference. Well, I could just feel John writing headlines behind me. And so when the meeting was over, sure enough, the meeting set up a clearness committee for later in the week. And that came off fine. I understood later that there were some people that were very much disapproving of the whole project, but I didn't know it then.
Clearness committee was to meet with you, or
Yeah.
or to?
Yeah, with me, and there were some people who held their tongues, and I didn't hear about it till later that they really disapproved. But John said, "Let me break the news. Let me break it in the paper." And I said, "No, you can't. No, no, no. You can't do that because I'm not supposed to tell it till Saturday." And he says, "If you call a press conference cold on Saturday, nobody will come. Why would they come?" And he said, let me break it on Wednesday. By that time, you'll have your visa. I was going to go on Tuesday to get my visa, and to Chicago. And he said, "I'll break the news on Wednesday, and you'll have everybody there on Saturday." And I did. And my telephone never stopped ringing from Wednesday night until I left on the plane. A week later, almost a week later. I never could sit down to a meal. I had people calling who wouldn't tell me their names and who thought I was a communist and a traitor. And I had people saying how wonderful.
How old were the children at this time?
All of them were grown except Ben and Andy, and they were 9 and 11 or something like that. I think 9 and 11. And Jean was, you know, my family's always been able to put a meal on for themselves. So I wasn't worried about them being able to take care of themselves. Jean had gone a lot of places, to Hong Kong and to Japan and various places, left me at home with kids. So I didn't see that this was anything worse. And he came to agree with me, but he didn't at first.
When you got back to the States, you came back to Madison then?
Mm-hmm.
And
The first person I saw was John Patrick Hunter. He practically climbed on the plane.
and was it to the extent that one of the missions was to, or what the Vietnamese requested that you do, is to go back to this country and see what you could do with
Do something about our
do
country.
something about the country, yes.
So we suggest we're going again.
All right, what should we talk about, folks? We were talking about...
Well, let's
We were talking about when I came back.
Yeah.
What what happened when I came back. And what happened was that the town just was berserk for a while. I was on the front page for 2 solid weeks, every single night, or morning, you know, as the case may be. And it was just overwhelming, you know. And Gene did have a fit then. He said, well, you've been away and you're back, now knock it off, you know. And I said, well, I can't, because I've got to make these, part of the project is going around and talking about it. And I just had to do it. And I was gone for a solid year. I was exactly 1 year after I got home. I got home on May 1st. And May 1st the next year, was the first time that I didn't have a speaking date ahead. The first day that I woke up in the morning and didn't have a date ahead. And and I made I made 208 speeches that year. Now I had never made one before in my life, and except at that press conference, that first press conference. So it was, you know, it was very, very hard at first, very, very hard. I was exhausted, and then I got tired just because there was so much of it, and I began to get cranky, real cranky toward the end. And there was Captain Bolenbeck. Remember hearing about him? He was a professional military man. He in World War II, or was it one? I don't know. He'd never quite made it into a war, but he was president of the some veterans group. And he followed me around the state. Every time I made a speech anywhere in this state, he was there. And he always asked the same question, which was the one that you asked. Did you ask to see prisoners? And I got very irritable about it after a while. At first I just answered it straight. And then when I began to feel myself wanting to snap at him, like, turn your hearing aid on, you know, or something nasty like that, I decided I'd had too much. And fortunately, May 1st came and I didn't have any more. But I got very irritable about, well, what he was doing was harassing me, you know. I mean, he'd come prepared to, and then he'd smirk at the whole crowd, you know, because he'd asked me a bad question. Well, I didn't think, you know, I didn't think my response was bad at all. You know, I thought it was okay. And but anyway, there was a lot of that, and I found some funny things out. One was that when Papa Hambone, George Vukalik, interviewed me, I couldn't get off the ground because he was too nice. You know, he absolutely agreed with me. He thought I was great, and he was low-keyed, and I couldn't get going. I couldn't get the words out, and I'd balk, you know, on the words would go. But then I get to, like I was talking on a radio station in Beloit one night, and I'd driven in there by myself, and I parked on a dark street, and I walked to this place, and the guy was friendly and got me a cup of coffee and everything, and I thought, oh, well, this is going to be another low-keyed one. The thing started to roll, and he said, "How come you're a commie pinko?" And I immediately got charged. My adrenaline came up, and I had a great time with that one. But he was so hostile. He was so hostile, and then he turned the camera off, and, well, that went pretty well, didn't it? You know, let's have another cup of coffee. But I kind of got used to that a lot of this was just what they thought they had to do. I don't know whether they were trying to satisfy their audiences as to their own politics, or whether he was smart enough to get me off the ground, you know. So there was an awful lot of all kinds of things: radio, television, big audiences, small audiences. Sometimes I just sat on the floor in a grubby office downtown, and I remember one time talking to a bunch of high school kids that what became the Alliance got together. It wasn't the Alliance then. And
reflecting from a couple decades away, would you do it again, or would you?
Oh, I'd do it tomorrow.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I'd have a little trouble hanging on the boat, but it was a tremendous experience. Yeah, I think it, and it did a whole lot for me as a person. I mean, when I got my first job at Geophysics as a clerk 2, doing some typing, and then evolved into a kind of a librarian, it took me 6 months to hear what people were asking me, because I was used to kids. I had 6 kids, and I was really, I couldn't quite hear what adults were saying. And it took me a while to get into an adult groove. And I think that happens to women a whole lot. And I think it's too bad. Maybe it doesn't happen as much anymore as it did then. But I was 43 before I got my first out-of-the-home job. And then this happened when I was 49. So that was real soon, see. And see, that just really charged me out of the baby care business real fast, you know. I wasn't doing that anymore. And I think it was very good for me. It sharpened my brain a whole lot. And it was satisfying politically and satisfying spiritually, and I felt I was doing what I ought to be doing. And people complained, you know, I mean, I got a lot of criticism, and a lot of it was understandable. I could understand where they were coming from, but I never felt that I had done something wrong. I always knew that it was right, and that was interesting, because I hadn't always been that confident of my own being right about things. So.
Did you feel at the time that you were doing it that you were doing a brave thing, or
brave thing?
Yeah.
No. I thought I was doing a great thing. I never thought of it as brave. We got that tossed at us a good bit, but it never fit. To be brave, you've got to be doing something you're afraid of. And I wasn't afraid of it. Maybe I should have been, but I wasn't. So. No, I thought we were doing something that needed doing, and that I was just lucky beyond all comprehension to have been the one woman, or any woman. And I was a Midwest, middle-aged, middle-class woman. You know, it was just perfect from my point of view, for me.
We shift gears a little. Could you tell us about Gene and his role in the meeting and whatever comes to mind?
All right. Gene was my husband, and we lived together and were married for 29 years, and then we're divorced. And then he died, well, maybe 18 years later, something like that. And we always stayed good friends. We were always good friends, even when everything else was wrong. Gene came along to the meeting. I mean, we joined the meeting together. This was a family of joint effort. Gene was the son of a congregational minister, and his brother was a congregational minister, and there was and I grew up in a congregational church, and my grandfather was a congregational minister who preached in Bohemian. So there was a whole set to the family of a traditional kind of a church, and so it was a blow to both families when we became Quakers. My mother thought that we had joined the Holy Rollers. But she came around after a while. But Gene was clerk at least twice, I think maybe 3 times in this meeting. He was Gene was very different from me. We weren't anything like the same kind of person. He was very intellectual, and his messages were always pretty intellectual in meeting, as I recall. They weren't the kind that I would be able to do, you know, and he couldn't do my kind, because I'm much more passionate. And he taught Sunday school, He was on all kinds of committees. I think he did a good job of being a meeting member through the years, and his kids remember him as being very much involved in the meeting. And I remember one time when he was clerk, we had a very nasty divorce going on in the meeting, and these two people took turns being in our house and tramping around and crying and carrying on. It was very emotional. And Jean handled this very well, I thought, and succeeded in nobody killed anybody, and nobody committed suicide, and the divorce did happen, and it got taken care of, you know, even though for a while it looked like it was just the worst thing you had ever heard of. And I thought he did a good job with that, and I think Jean was a super member of the meeting, very valuable member.
What Irma Duncan?
Irma Duncan was a darling. She was. I got to know her even better after I moved away, because she would go to Friends General Conference, and she was almost blind by that time, and I guided her around from one meeting to another, and spent a lot more time with her than I ever had before. And I think that was 2 years in a row that we did that. She was, I remember her way back when we went to an all-day retreat kind of, or just maybe a picnic at the West Bend. Is there a West Bend in Wisconsin?
Yes.
All right, over near Milwaukee. Well, there was a fellow there from Germany who had a log cabin, and he invited the whole meeting over there, and it was through Irma. Irma was the one who knew him, and that was lovely. And she was quite young in those days. She was very perky, and she sang. She was a professional singer. I mean, she had a degree in voice from maybe Oberlin, I'm not sure, and was still singing, not just in her grade school where she taught, but other places too. She was a great woman. I liked Irma I liked Irma's sister, Mildred Ashman, very much too, and Mildred's husband, Benjamin. He taught me how to keep bees. I kept bees for a few years. And I told you earlier that Mildred was the one who listened to me when I first joined the meeting, and when I kind of dumped all my woes. And she was a great woman. Another person who was in the meeting when I joined it was Dorothy Ackerman, who lives up in Minneapolis now. And she had 2 little kids. Her husband was a physicist, and I think he was a student still then. And I got to know her quite well. Merritt Hughes.
Merritt Hughes, yes.
Merritt Hughes, an English professor, a specialist in Milton. And his wife Grace, who was a Scottish woman with a nice burr to her voice, and they had a couple kids whom I knew at various times. They lived in a house that I admired very much, up on near the President's Mansion, and they were very, very important people. And I remember when we had the Peace Center down on in an old A&P store or something like that, down on University Avenue. Chester Graham and I was working there one day a week, and so was Grace, or maybe a couple days a week. And Grace Hughes and I did it together, and that was nice. And she did a whole lot of on a steady basis. She visited Lois Anderson, who was totally incapacitated, and John wanted people to come if they could promised to come on a regular basis, but not otherwise. And Grace was able to do that, and did for quite a few years, visited Lois regularly. Other people?
Let me interrupt from
yeah.
talking.
Yeah. Well, you asked me the questions then. Okay.
Trouble is, I'm not familiar enough that.
Well, you want me to just ramble on about some of these older people?
Sure.
Do you remember the name of the old man who ultimately fell down the stairs at, oh geez, at Bettina's house during monthly meeting? He was a bookbinder, and in his old age, he was binding books as something that he did. After he'd retired from whatever his business was.
I know where I can look it up because I read about that incident.
This sounds vaguely familiar.
Yeah,
Seems
we
like it's
we
come
chatted
up.
about it at
I think your folks were there.
Reminiscence.
Yeah.
And
It was very shocking.
I
But
can get that name.
I don't really know very much about him, except that he was a very old man, and he came to meeting by himself. He lived alone down on one of these courts just off University Avenue that cuts in on the bend. On the bend of University, there's a couple little courts in there. Can't think of the name of them. They might not even be there anymore. You know, things change.
How will I find it?
It's way back in the beginning. Let's see, who else?
How about Lila Bascom?
Oh, Lelia. Lelia was wonderful. Lelia was very old when, well, she was pretty old when I first knew her, and very tiny. And she was one of these heroic people who taught English all over the state in the extension divisions. And instead of, she had a route that she went each week by bus and train. Not planes and driving, but the hard way. And sometimes she'd take whatever transportation there was, and she'd go from one town to another, and then she'd end up back in Madison on Sunday and come to meeting, and then she'd do this route again. And she was pretty close to retirement when I first knew her, but she'd been doing this for years, and teaching one or two courses here and one or two courses in the next town, and then on to the next town. Deadly. I just don't know how she stood that. And she lived very poor. She took early retirement because she thought, well, mainly because she thought she'd die if she didn't. That's what she said. It was too hard a life. And so that meant she retired on much less than ordinarily. And the retirement wasn't much in those days anyway. And so she lived very poor in a small apartment about where the Humanities Building is now, somewhere in there. A little court that doesn't exist anymore. And one time, when one of my daughters was grown up tall, about 5 feet 8 or 9, she said, let's see how this joke goes. Oh, I know. Lelia said to her when she saw her after not having seen her for years, she said, "Oh, you've gotten so big, and I can remember when you were very, very little." And Suki said, "Yes, I used to look up at you and say, 'Hi, Lelia.'" And Lelia said, "And now you look down at me and say, 'Lo, Lelia.'" Very, very clever little lady. And she was just a very valuable member. She and gutsy too. There were times, I remember a couple times when things were going in meeting for business, when she didn't like what we were doing, she simply stopped it. For instance, a group of us tried to start a Quaker school, modeled a little bit on Scattergood. And we thought we could do it, and we lined up a bunch of people. We had Frances Fay, who was going to be the headmaster, You know, we had a lot of people that we really had it thought through. And Lelia just thought it was a lousy idea. She did not believe in private schools. She believed in public schools, and she just didn't let it happen. And it was a little hard to take, you know, that all our lovely plans were down the drain. You kids probably would have gone to it if we'd gotten it. I don't know. I think your folks were involved in the discussions anyway. And,
Really? Something I'm not aware of.
name somebody else.
We could, if you want to stop for a while, Jack, we could just let her page through this.
Hanson, it was his last name.
Hanson.
You want to do that?
His name was Hanson.
You want to tell the story about
About what?
the
Falling down the
man
stairs?
from downstairs?
Give me that thing for a minute.
Think about another era. Do you remember about the circumstances leading up to the meeting, getting the meeting house, the first meeting house over on Monroe Street?
Not really. I don't really remember what all the discussion was about getting the meeting house, the first meeting house on Monroe Street. I know that we met in the Congregational Student House, and then we met in the Baptist Student House. That was much better for some reason. We had a lot more. We began to get more people. And I think there was more place for first day school, and the rooms were bigger and more pleasant. And but we still had a problem of location, you know, of where are you and where are we, you know, and do people know how to find us and that sort of thing. And I remember that Lelia Bascom had disapproved in general of spending money on a building. She thought that wasn't where our money should go. But then she came around to it and she said, after all, we've been cuckoos in other people's nests long enough. And she had a neat way of turning a phrase. And so we did get a mortgage on the first house on the corner. And Nat Sample and some other people worked, well, Nat worked on the design of taking out some non-bearing walls and so forth, and making the room larger, and then a lot of work was done on it to make it a meeting room, and Helen Allen wanted to be sure that the walls were Quaker gray, and she was very much, she pushed the idea of this fabric cloth, or whatever it's called, something that looked like it's woven, or it was woven. It was cloth that was glued up on the wall, and it started out being the right color and then had to be painted several times after that, and it got a little different looking. But a lot of people took a hand. There was a lot of individual labor gone into the place. And then after we'd been there a few years, that building was remortgaged, and with the money we got from it, we bought the second building. And there was always a kind of an idea that we could connect the two, and there were plans drawn for that, but it turned out that the zoning never allowed it. But we always had tenants on the second floor of both buildings, which made it possible to pay for it, and that was the way it was done. I think it was handled very, very well. Somebody had very good real estate sense about those two buildings, because a little later, quite a bit later, the two buildings were both mortgaged to provide seed money for Quaker housing out on the south side. And that was, I think that money came back. I'm not real positive about these things because I'm not good at real estate. But I think the money came back when the government just insisted that it be paid, that there be seed money in there from some organization. And so that thing got built, and we had two buildings. And when the meeting, and it was a very small meeting at the time that the first building was acquired, but we doubled our membership the first year. that we had the building. I've been trying to tell people back in where I live now in Massachusetts that we would have more people if we could hang our sign out all week instead of for 2 hours on Sunday. And that's part of it. That's also that you have a place to put your library. You have a place to put to have meetings, and you have a place and that people know you're going to be there, that you're kind of a permanent citizen instead of just a fly-by-night outfit. And so I think that having a meeting house is important, even though it does dissipate money that you could use for Nicaraguan relief or something like that. I'm not sure people use it for Nicaraguan relief anyway, you know. And I think a meeting house is a good idea. And I think the fact that they were able to parlay it into this beautiful building, that the Madison Meeting was able to sell those two buildings and get enough to buy this thing and to fix it up. I know it's been a struggle, and there's been a lot of money raised and so forth, but it's been so nice. And I was kind of opposed to all that work out in the front. I thought that's too bad to spend money on that kind of stuff. I was being Lelia again on that. But I've come around to it because it's just really made it so attractive. And what's happened out in the back downstairs, I think is really nice. It opened up the back of the building to light and air and so forth. So, and I think that it's very important to have a place for the meeting to gather to make its plans about what it's going to do. And we just meet in a neighborhood center now, and we're very limited. Our books are in the basement; they're rotting. You know, it's not good. And in Acton, and I wish that our group was as foresighted as this, because it's almost as old a group as this, but it's gone nowhere.
Although there have been jumps in membership in Madison Meeting, and you touched on some of them just now, reasons for them. Quakerism has grown also very steadily over all these years.
But not in
Madison.
Acton.
But not.
We've grown from 13 to sometimes 30, which is in 9 years.
Mm.
Well, maybe my vision is short, but I think we'd do better if we had a place where our sign hung out all week.
Yeah. Question I was going to ask is what do you think it is that draws people over the years to Quakerism?
Well, I think it's just chance, really, that somebody says something, or that they have a need. Some people I think some people read about it and discover it that way and think, well, that sounds like something I'd like. On the other hand, I think there are people who, a great many people, just stumble onto it the way I did. And I don't know how you got into it. I know how you did. You were born into it. You couldn't help it. But you've come back, see? You had some knowledge, though. And a lot of people don't have any knowledge and just kind of stumble into it. And it's pretty fascinating form of religion if people, if a person just opens up to it. I don't know. I think it's really important. I think that's a good question, because how did you get into it, or how does a person get into it? And I think you can only answer for yourself, really. But I have been wishing that, through the years, I keep wishing that the peace movement would do that. If we would just, when we're sitting in a room with 20 people who've all come into the peace movement, how did you get in? Because we keep fumbling around about how are we going to get more people in. Well, how did we get in? And I think that's all we need to know. You know, what really, and I don't think we ever do that, or very rarely do we sit around and talk about how we got into the peace movement, because that's when we really do want to proselytize. Yeah, and I mean, I'm not sure we want to do that with Quakerism, but it's important to talk about how we made it, what our needs were. Yeah.
What do you remember about the Friends Campus Center and any related student connection with campus activities?
Well, two of my daughters married people that they met there at the Friends Campus Center, so I have quite a connection with it in my mind. It started because we felt that Friends, we already had a meeting house, and we felt that the Friends on the campus should have a location too. And that, you know, why shouldn't they have a chance to be together? And we started this co-op house, rented. We had 2 different buildings, maybe even more than that, but to my knowledge, we had one over on well, I'm not sure just where that one was. In fact, I probably can't name either of them now.
There was Murray Street.
Murray Street is the
Brook
one.
Street.
Murray and Brooks. Murray was first, and that was really kind of a grubby little building, but a lot of good things happened there. Suki lived there, and then the thing was moved over to Brook Street, where there's a park now in front of the YMCA, and in the middle of that block was a very nice house that was called Brooks Inn or something like that. And we had an American Friends Service Committee office in each of those buildings, and I spent a lot of time there both before and after I went to Vietnam. So it was about in those years that we did it. And that was the first co-ed house in Madison, on the Madison campus. And even there, they had the girls on the top floor and the boys on the bottom floor because they couldn't share a bathroom, you know. And that all disappeared very, very soon. The thing just, nobody cared whether it was a his and hers bathroom or what it was anymore. But the first few years, it was very rigidly kept that way. And they ate there, they took turns cooking, and they had a real co-op house. It worked very well. There were a lot of interesting people in that house. And Erica lived in the Brooks Street one, and met Doug there, Doug Kraft, whom she married, and whom I live next door to now.